Hello, everybody. Welcome to this lecture here in the Psychology 101 lecture series that I've been doing now for the past few months. And so we're on to the biological perspective. We're going to talk about the evolution of genetics and behavior in this section. And so we're going to try to get through it to the best of our ability without making it boring here. So here we go. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about in this lecture. We're going to talk about basically the nature versus nurture debate to a degree. We're going to talk about how for many years psychologists have looked at the many ways that human beings are alike, no matter what the background or where they live, who they love, how they celebrate marriages, mourn losses, argue, work, plan for the future, or reminisce about the past. We're also going to look at how psychologists look at how human beings differ, such as how some are extroverts, they're always ready to party, and some are introverted, they prefer to read a book at home and quiet. Some are creative, while others are content with routine. And to address the questions of why people are alike, why they're different, and psychologists have engaged in one of the oldest debates in the social sciences, and that's the nature versus nurture debate. So, Edward L. Thorndike from 1903, he was one of the leading psychologists of the early 1900s who took a stake in this nature argument. He claimed that in the actual race of life, heredity is the determinant factor. However, behaviorist John B. Watson in 1925 insisted that experience could write virtually any message on the blank slate of human nature. So they looked at the human mind as a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. However, since 1925 all the way here to 2020, we've kind of figured out that the blank slate isn't actually a thing. Humans aren't blank slates. There's instincts that we're born with. We have temperaments we're born with, and of course, it's. I think we talked about it in one of the earlier lectures of the biopsychosocial sphere, because you have your biology, your psychology. That's what you think, and of course, your social. So you have to look at your environment, your social environment, the way that you think about things, and of course your biology all work together to figure out like who you are as a human being, so you're not a blank slate. There's an excellent book by Steven Pinker that we'll talk about that talks about the blank slate and how that's just an absurd presupposition to hold on to. We'll also look at the nature side of the argument and the findings of the two related fields within the biological perspective. We're going to talk about evolutionary psychology and how it emphasizes evolutionary mechanisms that may help explain the commonalities in language and learning, attention, perception, memory, sexual behavior, reasoning, and other aspects of human psychology. We're going to also talk about behavioral genetics that contribute, the heredity of individual differences in personality, mental ability, and other human characteristics. However, it is important that we have to note that nobody argues in the terms of nature versus nurture. We actually understand that heredity and environment will interact to produce our psychological, physical traits. Okay, so let's deep dive into unlocking the secret of genes. So we're going to spend a little bit talk about biology. So if you look closely at genes, the basic units of heredity itself, they're located on the chromosomes. They're rod-shaped structures that are found in every cell of the body. They come in either XX or XY depending on the sex. Each sperm cell, and each egg cell each contain 23 chromosomes, so that when they unite at conception, the fertilized egg and all the body cells and everything, they have 46 total chromosomes that are arranged in 23 pairs. So you get 23 from your parents, both your dad and your mom, and combine it, you get 46 chromosomes that are arranged in 23 pairs. The chromosomes themselves consist of thread-like strands of DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid molecules, and the genes consist of small segments of that DNA. Each human chromosome contains thousands of these genes, which are in fixed locations on the chromosomes. And estimates of the total number of human genes range from fewer than 30,000, I think, up to more than 150,000. So collectively, all of these genes are what we call the human genome. Yeah, I know this is a psychology course, but yet we're getting into some biology, and I think it's important that we talk about biology if we're going to look at evolutionary psychology. So, within each gene, there are four basic chemical elements within the DNA, and that's identified by the letters A, T, G, and C. And so they're proteins basically. It's like adenine. I can't remember what the other three are off the top of my head, but they're arranged in a particular order. For example, ACG, TC, TCT, ATA. And this sequence could code for a particular protein that affects the whole system of the body, or a whole body system. And identifying even a single gene is a daunting task. In fact, Joseph Levine, who is a biologist, and a geneticist by the name of David Suzuki, both in 1993, compared it to searching for an individual when all you know is they live somewhere on Earth, because most human traits are, and especially the straightforward ones like height or eye color, depend on more than one gene pairing. Tracking down the genetic contribution to a trait is even more difficult. Researchers usually have to clone and produce copies of several stretches of DNA on the chromosome, and then use indirect methods to locate a given gene. So it makes it kind of difficult to kind of figure out where the gene is. So one method used for searching for genes associated with, the physical and mental conditions involving doing linkage studies, which look for patterns in the inheritance of genetic markers in large families in which a particular condition is common. You can think of, like, say, Down syndrome, or I think they're looking at how to do this as far as like genetic markers for like schizophrenia and stuff like that when you're talking clinical psychology. Well, more psychiatry than clinical psychology, because clinical psychologists just kind of look for the diagnostics of schizophrenia and the type of psychotherapy used to help those individuals. Psychiatry looks more at the genetic markers to figure out the risk factors and, of course, the different medications that will actually work with a person's condition, whether it's a typical or an atypical antipsychotic medication. And so these genetic markers are segments of DNA that vary among individuals, which has a known location on a chromosome and can function as a genetic landmark for a gene involved in a physical or mental condition. And as I talked about, these examples are like depression, schizophrenia, or even bipolar affective disorders. So the genetics of similarity. So one question that was asked at the beginning of this lecture is, how do we explain human similarities when it comes to experiences and behaviors that appear to be universal? So evolutionary psychologists believe the answer lies within genetic dispositions. And they developed during the evolution of our species. A British scientist by the name of Steve Jones in 1994 wrote that, genetics is the key to the past, and every human gene must have an ancestor. Each gene is a message from our forebears, and they contain the whole story of human evolution. So you could think of those genes as like chapters within a book, and the book being, the human species or the evolution thereof. So to read these messages from the past that are locked within our genes, we got to understand the nature of evolution itself. So evolution is basically a change in gene frequencies within a population over many generations, and as particular genes become more common in a population or less common, the characteristics that they influence also change. It's like some people think that evolution is a random process, and that's not entirely true. The mutations are random, which we're going to talk about, the mutations, but the selection mechanisms are not quite so random. And so we'll talk about like the selection mechanisms, especially when it comes to human evolution. So why do gene frequencies in a population change? Why don't they stay the same from one generation to another? We could think of it as like one part of the reason is that during meiosis, and if my students out here that are watching this online, and I consider you my students, you're watching the lecture, so you're getting something out of it. So meiosis is the splitting of the cells that become the sex cells, like your sperm cells or your egg cells. It's different, say, than the division within your body cells. We call that mitosis. And one of the interesting things ways that I learned to remember it is, think of, for body cells or somatic cells, with mitosis, my toes, because your toe is a body part, so it's a somatic part. And then meiosis is, well, me. That's the chromosomes that made me. That's the sex cells. That's the sperm and the egg kind of thing. I think mitosis and mitose, I think, is the best way to remember if you're looking at cell division between sex cells and body cells. Is body cells are somatic. That's the toes. That's mitosis. Sex cells is meiosis. Okay. So We talked about meiosis a bit. And that's, of course, the division of cells that make the egg and sperm cells. So if a coding error in the copying of the original DNA sequence occurs, that's at ATCG in whatever sequence you want to put it at. If there's a error in the copying of that, the genes can spontaneously change. It's what we call a mutation. Remember, I said the mutations are random. In addition, sometimes during meiosis, when the chromosomes cross over, the alleles, which are the small segments of genetic material, are apt to cross over from one pair to another pair, and sometimes they will brush, and you'll get a mix, and you'll get you'll get a new version of that allele, and get a new genetic variation, which is potentially possibly a new traits. These mutations or these new traits, they can either be advantageous and they have a positive effect on the organism. So it might be a trait or characteristic that actually makes them better able to survive, or they might be deleterious and they might actually cause the organism harm. Now, according to the principle of natural selection, and that was first formulated by Charles Darwin, who was a British naturalist, in his book Origin of Species. It came out in 1859. The fate of these genetic variations depends on the environmental pressure or the environmental factors that can affect that, right? So the concept is known as survival of the fittest, and biological fitness is essentially those who have adaptations to thrive in an environment will live long enough to reproduce and pass those genes on to those who cannot survive. So you can think of biological fitness as not how strong you are or how fast you are, it's just are you able to reproduce, have children, and are those children able to reproduce? And the more offspring and progeny of the species, the more you're going to be, the more biologically fit you are. So, and so here's an example. The Galapagos Islands is considered a natural lab for studying evolution. You can actually watch different species of birds, they're finches. They noticed that during a drought, all of the finch species that had the tiny little beaks that were thin enough for picking up seeds, well, because it was a drought, there weren't any seeds, and so a lot of them starved to death, and they died off. But finches there was more finches that started to emerge that had thicker beaks, and so they were more adapted to eating nuts because nuts were in the ground. And so because one species died out, the finches with the thicker beaks actually managed to survive. And so that was, natural processes on Earth that selected that gene for that thicker beak for eating nuts was adapted to that drought-like environment. So you got to see, a species kind of take over and become more biologically fit because there was more food, so they were able to reproduce and have viable offspring. So that's kind of how that works. So when it comes to the genetics of similarity, evolution, and natural selection, scientists have watched these processes occur before our very eyes in organisms that change rapidly. And you see it in microbes, insects, various plants, like I mentioned, the finches in the Galapagos Islands. So evolutionary principles such as natural selection now guide the biological sciences. Evolutionary biologists often start with an observation about some characteristic, and then they try to account for it in evolutionary terms. For example, why do male peacocks have such fabulously colored feathers, and females kind of look more drab? Well, because during the evolution of the peacocks, males put on a display that attract females. So the flashiest males have the best opportunity to mate. So it gives them a wider range of access to reproductive resources, being the female peacocks, and then propagates the species. And so evolutionary psychologists work in the same way, but take the slightly different track. They start asking what sort of challenges human beings may have faced in the prehistoric past. Having to decide on which foods to eat may have led our ancestors to have discussed responses to bitter foods, and they need to avoid those poisonous foods. And so that's kind of discussed. It's part of a behavioral immune system. It keeps us from eating poisons and stuff like that. And so the guiding assumption in evolutionary psychology is that the human mind evolved with as a collection of specialized and independent modules to handle specific survival problems. And I know the screen comes in and out, but I got to be able to read all this because a lot of this information's on here. So we talked about the blank slate. So Steven Pinker explains that if a mental module for some behavior exists, then neuroscientists should eventually be able to discover the circuits or subsystems in the brain that are associated with it. So, and he looks at it as like when children solve problems for which they have the mental modules, they should look like geniuses. Knowing things that have not been taught should be a long, hard slog. However, they learn language without thinking twice, but learning geometry is indeed in itself a hard and long slog. So, there's a mental module they think that allows babies to pick up language easier, because and you would think that as an adult it's harder to learn a second language, whereas as a child you just learn to speak the language that you're brought up around. And so because of how our species evolved, many abilities, tendencies, and characteristics are either present in all human beings at birth or rapidly as a child they mature, and therefore they qualify as mental modules. And here's a few examples of these traits. So like infant reflexes, for example. They're simple automatic responses to specific stimuli. They'll turn their heads toward the touch of a cheek or a corner of the mouth and search for something to suck on. That's a rooting reflex. It allows them to find, the breast or the bottle so that they can feed. That's kind of what they do. And they also have an attraction to novelty, because novelty is appealing to human beings and many other species. If a rat has its dinner, for example, it prefers to explore unknown territory, such as an unfamiliar wing of a maze. Human babies reveal a surprising interest in looking at and listening to new and unfamiliar things as they stop nursing when a new person enters their range of vision. There's also the desire to explore and manipulate objects. All birds, mammals, and primates have taken an innate inclination. Primates especially like to, what they say, monkey about with things, taking them apart, examining the pieces, and apparently for the sheer pleasure of it. Human babies will shake, rattles, bang pots, and grasp at whatever they can grip with their tiny hands. It's the same principle, essentially. There's the impulse to play and fool around. You can think of kittens and lion cubs, puppies, pandas, all the young primates. They will all play and pounce on one another all day until either hunger or tiredness manifests. Play and exploration may be a biological adaptation for helping members of a species find food or cope with the environment. Or kittens will stalk and pounce on toys. Or there'd be hunting skills, that humans play in large groups to learn, so that they can learn their motor skills and how to cooperate and be better hunters, because you want to follow the best hunters out into the world to hunt, because if you follow a person who's not a very good hunter, the possibility of dying is obviously much greater, and so that's not going to do very much for you in the evolutionary game, roughly speaking. Basic mental skills, taking advantage of the fact that infants look longer at novel stimuli or surprising stimuli than at familiar ones. Psychologists have designed delightfully imaginative methods to test what tiny babies know, and they find that at 4 months of age, babies seem to understand some basic principles of math. By 18 months, for example, babies know that 4 is more than 3, 3 is more than 2, and 2 is more than 1. They can't count it, but they know the difference between less than and more than. And evolutionary psychologists believe that these fundamental skills evolved because they were useful to our ancestors. So, we want to talk about the origins of perception for a second. So, when you look closely at some of the human characteristics that are of special interest to evolutionary psychologists, perceptual abilities are kind of at the top of the list, along with emotional expressions, the need for sociability and attachment, the capacity for language, and by far the most controversial for some bloody reason is the gender differences in sexual behavior, which we're going to talk about that because there's nothing controversial about it at all. So Sherrill Jennings was a young blind man who had a successful life as a massage therapist. He could read Braille. He enjoyed sports by listening to it on the radio, and his fiancée urged him to get surgery to restore his sight. And though his eyes now functioned well, his world just fell into absolute chaos. And so what happened was he had poor depth perception, so he would constantly trip over things. His own shadow confused the hell out of him. He had issues interpreting facial expressions, and the bodies of his massage clients disgusted him. And like other people who had their eyesight restored later in life, his eyesight began to deteriorate again. And what's funny is he was actually happier about it and found that he preferred not having his sight. So his story illustrates an important distinction. For one thing, the visual receptors in the eyes to detect and respond to change in the physical energy emitted or reflected by objects in the environment. That's considered sensation, and yet it's another thing for the brain to interpret and organize that information, and that's what perception is. So sensation makes you aware of a sound or a form or a color, and it is the perceptual processes that make those patterns meaningful. And so that's kind of part of the whole AI thing is, we look at the world and perceive the world, and we perceive the world as a place of action. And so some of the things that are in the world that we perceive that work toward that action has to have some sort of meaning. And, the artificial intelligence things and the cognitive scientists have all realized that, so far we're the only people that can perceive the world in a matter of many viable interpretations that are meaningful enough to allow us to move forward based upon our perception, if that makes any sense. And so psychologists are interested in cases like Searle's because of the clues that they may offer in solving, an old problem. Which aspects of sensation and perception have our evolutionary past really prepared us for? Because when babies open their eyes for the first time, it's like, do they see the same sights and hear the same sounds or the same taste of the flavors that adults do? However, unfortunately, fascinating cases like Searle's do have some drawbacks scientifically, because blind people who regain their sight have relied on their other senses for most of their lives, so their reliance may interfere with visual perceptual systems, to where the visual world makes no sense to them, so it doesn't mean anything to them. Like the auditory perception of the world means more than the visual perception. So it's kind of odd. On again, when you test an infant's perception, or at least the idea of depth perception, it actually requires a considerable amount of ingenuity. And one of the clever procedures that was come up with for decades was what was called the visual cliff. Now, the cliff is this pane of glass that covers like the shallow surface at one side, and on the other side there's this deep one, right? And so both surfaces are covered by this checkboard, and the child is placed on the board in the center while the child's mother tries to coax the baby to come across the shallow end or the deep end. And babies will, as young as 6 months, they'll crawl to their mothers across the shallow side, but will refuse to crawl over the cliff. And so their hesitation shows this existence of the depth perception at that age. So they don't know it, but they act as if they know it, if that makes any sense. They can't tell you, oh, well, that's deep and that's shallow, but they act it out. Now, in his book, The Expression of Emotions, in Man and Animals, Charles Darwin argues that certain human facial expressions of emotion, such as the smile, the frown, the grimace, and the glare, are as biologically ordained as, say, the flutter of a frightened bird or the purr of a contented cat. You could think of it also as like the snarl of a threatened wolf, and such expressions evolved so that our forebears could tell, a friendly stranger from, say, a hostile one. And so modern psychologists have supported Darwin's evolutionary explanation by confirming that certain emotional expressions are universal the world over. There's a psychologist by the name of Paul Ekman and his colleagues. They gathered abundant evidence for the universe of 7 basic facial expressions of emotion: anger, disgust, happiness, fear, surprise, sadness, and contempt. In every culture they studied, from Brazil to these isolated tribes, these expressions are universal throughout all these cultures. And so universal emotional expression allows us to communicate our intentions to others and evokes a response for them to read the intentions of others. However, this does not mean that everybody in a society can recognize the same expressions in all situations. So that's that perceptual giving meaning to and understanding context. Psychologists have also found that some expressions resembling those of adults are present at birth, and pretty much the same 7 that are universal across cultures. Babies also respond to the emotional expressions of their parents, especially if they're happy. So you can also look at personality differences between people, and also explains how they experience emotion. Now, what I study is, of course, the 5-factor model, or the big 5 of personality traits, the big 5. and it's the most empirically reliable model for measuring personality traits. And there's 3 traits within the big 5 that are correlated to emotion. It's conscientiousness, extroversion, and neuroticism. The volatility aspect of trait neuroticism is a broad descriptor for emotional lability. That's irritability, anger, emotional dysregulation. The second aspect, withdrawal, describes negative affect. So you can think of that as like sadness, fear, that kind of things. Things that make you kind of withdraw from things. So it's not approach emotion, it's withdrawal emotion. And so the enthusiasm aspect of trait extroversion is broad enough to encompass positive emotion and sociability. So that's approach and positive emotion. Orderliness is an aspect of trait conscientiousness, and it describes the outcome of behavior that is the part of the ordering process. So it's tied to tidiness, procedure, rules, routine, and detail, and it's also correlated to the emotion of disgust. In the original paper by Kiernan and Chapman, it was actually described as trait disgust, but it's actually an emotion. And so starting at the first year, babies begin to intentionally alter their own behavior in reaction to their parents' facial expressions and emotions. And this ability has survival value. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, think about it. If an infant can recognize facial expressions, is what allows babies to look for safety signals in real situations where they don't have the necessary skills to judge danger. So we've all heard the term stranger danger, right? So friendly faces tend to evoke a sense of safety, whereas if you're frightened of a face, you might think they're untrustworthy. And so that idea of stranger danger comes to mind, and then, babies tend to shy away from things that frighten them, unless they're non-reactive and don't care, and then of course they're going to go explore the territory that's unknown and possibly get kidnapped by a stranger. So we're going to talk about sociability and attachment. So unlike the tadpole or the tarantula, human babies cannot live without care and attention from its own kind. I think human babies are like the only mammalian animal, if not the only animal on the planet, if you're speaking strictly in evolutionary terms, that are absolutely helpless upon birth. They can't do anything for themselves. And so one of the things about that is without other people, we languish physically and emotionally. Without the universal need for affiliation and cooperation, human societies would never have survived, let alone expand to the degree that they have. And that's because we're naturally predisposed to form attachments and learn from others. And newborn babies are sociable from birth. For one thing, they immediately pay attention to human faces. Is because there's specific visual cells in the brain that actually respond maximally to faces. So they're maximally interesting. And this preference has survival value because they recognize where the next meal is coming from. But by the age of 4 to 6 weeks, they smile regularly, especially in response to faces, despite not having the foggiest clue of whom they're smiling at. During nursing, babies and their mothers tend to have this game where they exchange signals like conversation. So babies will have this rhythmic pattern of sucking, whether it's on a bottle or on the breast, and then they'll pause, and then of course the parent might jiggle them a little bit. And so it's like this nonverbal communication between suckling and jiggling the baby. And so what they call this is synchrony. And it's not to be confused with Jung's idea of synchronicity, which is something completely different in that regard. So the dialogue illustrates this crucial aspect of all human exchange. It's called synchrony. And it's the adjustment of one person's nonverbal behavior in coordination to another's. This is done unconsciously. So when people adjust their speech, which is how they talk or what they say, their expressions, their gestures, they do it to be in sync with that other person. And it's the mirror neurons in the brain that are associated with that, where people try to mirror. Like if someone smiles at you, you'll smile back. If someone frowns at you, you'll frown back. Someone takes a slow way of talking, and then you, of course, slow your speech down and vice versa. So that's kind of what synchrony is, whereas synchronicity is absolutely completely different. So all primate infants, attachment is that deep emotional tie to the caregivers, or grow out of what's called contact comfort. and the pleasure of being touched and held. So, two primatologists, Margaret and Harry Harlow, first demonstrated the importance of contact comfort when they were raising baby rhesus monkeys. And they used two artificial mothers. The first was made of wire that just had like a bottle and warming lights to produce food and warmth. They had another artificial mother that was also made from wire but was wrapped in a soft hairy cloth. And at the time, psychologists thought attachment was formed because parents provide warmth and food. However, whenever the infant monkeys would become frightened, they ran to and clung to the terry cloth mother because cuddling with them calmed them down. Human infants, too, initially become attached to their mothers and caregivers because of the contact comfort they provide. Indeed, cuddling is near as important as food. And this is because young children need that safety base to return to, especially if they're out trying to explore. Like, if you've ever seen a small child, they're shy and they're unsure of the world. And so if you take them to like a new park or playground, they'll wander off a little bit and they might run back to their mom. Well, that's that safe space of order. That's what they know. So they'll explore a little bit of the unknown territory, get scared, run back. So it's like this safe space, this safe baseline place where you can return to feel safe when you're getting overstimulated if you're exploring something new. And so that's where that contact comfort comes in. So many psychologists are concerned about infants who do not have secure attachments to loving adults because these babies grow up to have emotional and behavioral problems that persist through life. Some think that a baby's attachment depends entirely on how the mother treats her baby within the first year of life. This notion was actually found to be incorrect. Today we know that differences in normal parent-child rearing practices do not affect the degree of attachment. Insecure attachment seems to stem from extreme neglect and abuse as seen in orphanages that were observed in Britain in the 1960s and 70s. They were noted first by John Bowlby, who was a psychiatrist. And a child's temperament may also play a factor in some children who are genetically predisposed to be anxious and difficult to comfort. And again, you could think of that as, trait neuroticism, especially if they're anxious and tend to be more withdrawn. So it's the withdrawal aspect of that trait. And to test how personality trait neuroticism is associated with negative emotion regulation and unpleasant hypothetical scenarios, a study was set up to use a Likert scale that ranged from 1 to 7. I think like 7. It's like they used for each scenario 144 participants imagine themselves in a hypothetical situation rated on a 7-point scale. 1 not at all, 4 somewhat, 7 very strongly, on how intensely they felt anger, disappointment, or unhappiness. They also read additional information on the scenario and rated their emotions again. That was test 2 before proceeding to the next scenario. For both test 1 and 2, the emotion ratings were combined across the 5 situations to provide a composite emotion score, which there was a Cronbach's alpha of 0.81, negative T2 Cronbach's alpha of 0.86. And then they used a repeated measures analysis of variance test, and the results was like the p-level was pointed at 0.05. And so it shows that individuals with high scores in trait neuroticism felt more strongly about the negative emotion of the situation, even if it improved. And so the differences in neuroticism and negative emotion doesn't necessarily result from reactivity, but from the differences in the regulation of negative emotion. And they also discussed that, the death or the chronic illness in a parent, even prenatal divorce, are considered stressful events that can affect attachment. So it's not a lot about parenting practices, except, extreme abuse and neglect. It mostly has to do with, is there any upsetting, stressful things that occur? And also by temperament, which we'll talk about temperament. If they're highly reactive, then they're going to score higher in trait neuroticism. So our human capacity for language. Now language is a set of rules that are used for combining elements that are in themselves meaningless into utterances that are convey meaning. They're usually sounds, but they can be gestures of American Sign Language. They can even be visual representations. It's like hieroglyphics or even human writing. Some non-human animals are capable to acquire some aspects of language if they get help from their human friends. However, We seem to be the only species that acquires it naturally. Other primates use like grunts, gestures, and screeches to alert others to danger and express emotion and attract attention. And remember, we talked about in the lecture where I mentioned that some monkeys have what's called the snake Ra, R-W-R-A-A, and that's where it literally means, holy shit, that's a big snake when they see a snake, and that's because affect-laden guttural utterances those circuits are also in humans, and when there's a neurological disorder like Tourette syndrome, it's that part of their brain that's activated. It's like it's the prey alert system in the brain that brings forth those affective laden utterances. It's what activates when you curse. Like if you're in traffic and somebody like cuts you off and you hit the steering wheel and it's like, oh shit, It's the same circuit. So in contrast, language, whether spoken or signal, allows humans to express and comprehend an infinite amount of utterances created on the spot. This is actually a critical ability because, except in a few fixed phrases like "how are you" or "get a life," most of the utterances we hear or make over the lifespan are new. How many new words do we hear? How many new utterances are come up with? And you could think of that as, there's some examples of new utterances, but I don't think I'm going to go there in this lecture. But for adults, mastering the rules of new language can be intimidating, but children can acquire new words at amazingly rapid rates. That's roughly about 9 words a day when you think about it, which equals about 14,000 new words during the preschool years. So they absorb these new words as they encounter them in conversation, typically after 1 or 2 uses of those words in context. And in a few years, those new words come together to form these sentences and produce all kinds of these new word combinations, new paragraphs, new sayings, new everything. And so, like I said, and, over time, you get new words. I think I want to say it was like 98 or 99. There used to be this show on MTV, if I remember correctly. It was called like the Syphil and Ollie Show. It was these weird sock puppet things, and it came on MTV late at night. And they came up with this phrase. It was supposed to be something, it was supposed to be analogous to, hey, that's cool or that's good. And it's like, and I think they said it was called like Crescent Fresh or something like that. It's just 2 words that normally what you wouldn't think would go together, but they meshed this word together. And it didn't really take off, but for those of us that used to stay up late and watch this weird stuff for whatever reason or another, it was just one of those things that kind of stuck with us as we kind of got older. So I thought I would share that with you. I guess new examples of new words that come to mind are some of these alternative pronoun things that you probably hear about online, like Z and Zir, for example. The gender neutral pronouns, those are new utterances that have managed to come into the public consciousness. And so I think I'm going to leave that at that for right now. At one time, psychologists presupposed that children acquired their linguistic ability by imitation and paying attention to adults when they correct their mistakes. However, linguist Noam Chomsky argued that language is far too complex for that to be learned bit by bit. And, thinking about like how you learn the world's capitals or the state's capitals, Chomsky knows that children not only have to figure out which sounds or gestures form words, but they also have to take the surface structure of a sentence, that's the form it's spoken in, and infer the lying deep structure, and that's, of course, the structure's meaning. And so an example of 2 sentences with completely different surface structures, but they have the same deep underlying structure, is the sentence, Mary kissed John, or John was kissed by Mary. So it's 2 completely different sentences, but they mean the same thing. And so to transform surface structures into deep structures, Chomsky thought that children have to apply the rules of grammar, which is called syntax, that govern word order and other linguistic features that determine the roles that words play in a sentence. Now, no one has been taught these rules explicitly to toddlers. Nobody's been teaching them, hey, this word goes here, this means this, Instead, Chomsky argued that the human brain develops, as Steven Pinker called it, a mental module for linguistic acquisition that allows children to develop the ability to use language if they're exposed to it. So over the years, linguists and psycholinguists, which are psychologists that study the psychology of language, what they did is they worked together many types of evidence to support his presupposition. And so the evidence they gathered was that children in different cultures go through similar stages of linguistic development. For example, they'll often form their first negatives by simply adding no or not to the beginning or the end of a sentence, like no get dirty. The commonalities seem to suggest that children have an inborn disposition to notice the core features common to all languages, even if they're seemingly different. Take like English and Bulgarian, for example. Children often combine words in ways that adults never would. They reduce apparent sentences, they reduce them. So a parent might say, hey, let's go to the store, and a kid might just say, go store. It's a two-word simplified thing. So they make those errors that adults don't. And one of the things that's also interesting is that adults don't constantly correct their children. They don't correct the syntax. They learn to speak or sign anyway. And theorists' explanations of this is that children are rewarded for saying the right words, and they're punished for errors. However, parents don't stop to correct every little thing that's wrong that their children says, but what they do actually is they will reward the child so long as they understand what they're trying to convey. Even children who are profoundly intellectually disordered acquire language. They have this facility for language that exceeds their abilities in many areas. So the gap actually lies between the general mental ability and the language ability. So there's a gap there, and it's especially striking with what's called Williams syndrome. They may have an inability to tie their shoes or complete even the simplest of tasks, but their vocabularies are massive. They might be able to tell you all about Einstein's theory of relativity, or they might talk to you about quantum mechanics or the complexities of how fish swim in water, but they can't do the simplest task, and that's what Williams syndrome looks like. And infants as young as 7 months can derive simple linguistic rules from just a string of sounds. It's like, so for example, if babies are exposed to artificial sentences with, like, say, an ABA pattern, like goo, ga, goo, for example, until they get bored. Then novelty sets in, so they want a new sentence structure, so it could be ABB, so it could be like goo, ga, ga, until they get bored with it, and then you go back and forth with ABA and ABB. And so these responses suggest that they learn how to discriminate the different structures from one another and eventually understand enough to produce words that work within that structure. And so, and they do this before they can even understand and produce words in and of themselves. So I thought that was, we needed to cap in on that. Now, Chomsky's ideas so revolutionized how psychologists think about human language and human nature that linguists now refer to his initial publication of his ideas as the event. Because Chomsky completely changed the questions that researchers ask about language development, and he kind of avoided the evolutionary implications himself. Other researchers suppose that innate facility for language evolved in humans because it permitted our ancestors to convey precise information about time, space, objects, events, negotiating alliances, and that contributed to our survival. In some anthropological circles, it's believed that our capacity for language is what allowed our species to evolve. So you could think of, if you think of the early hominids, like say Homo neanderthalis, for example, because Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, humans, modern humans, at one point they occupied the world at the same time before one kind of went away. Whether they were, bred with humans and bred out of extinction, or competed to extinction, it's presupposed that they had the capacity for language, but we excelled at it, and because of our excellent abilities to acquire language naturally helped us evolve from our simple hunter-gatherer tribes to form more complex societies over time. That's something I learned in one of my anthropology classes, and I figured it'd be interesting enough to relay to you guys. And, you know, who knows, you might find that kind of useful or interesting to know. However, there is a case that environment plays a factor in linguistic acquisition. In the tragic cases of abandoned and abused children, for example, who have been isolated from normal conversation until their late childhood, after they're rescued, they might learn simple sentences to convey their basic needs, but rarely do they actually catch up grammatically. So it's likely that the linguistic acquisition program has a critical period in childhood, sort of a make it or break it period, in which children must be exposed to language and must have the opportunity to practice their emerging linguistic skills so that way they can actually use language effectively. So now we get to evolution, courtship, and mating, because for some reason this is the most controversial part of the debate in social sciences for some bloody reason. So we discussed genes and how they contribute to how we examine our world. So what about human social customs such as warfare, cooperation, and politics? Well, social scientists heartily disagree about the role of biology and evolution and what they play in complex social behaviors. This is where the debate gets heated more than over the origin of the male-female differences, and this debate, nowhere is this debate more heated than over the origin of male and female differences in sexual behavior, and so we're going to focus on this topic. The evolutionary perspective on mating practices has been strongly influenced by sociobiology. It's an interdisciplinary field that emphasizes evolutionary explanations for social behavior in animals and humans. Sociobiologists contend that evolution has bred into each of us a tendency to act in ways that maximize our reproductive successes. This is that survival drive that motivates altruism, which is helping others. That's kind of part of compassion. It's trait agreeableness from a Big Five perspective. And xenophobia, the fear of strangers, which kind of operates with disgust, really, when you think about it. It's not fear, it's disgust. I plan on tackling that when we get to, if these series of lectures are good enough, and you'll have to let me know in the comments if they're good enough. I do plan on doing a personality class, and we're going to talk about how trait disgust contributes to atrocity, especially with what happened in the 20th century. So we'll go into that. But in the sociobiological view, just as nature selected physical characteristics that are adaptive, nature selected psychological traits and social customs that aid in propagating their genes. Sociobiologists believe that males and females of most species have faced different kinds of survival and mating problems. The sexes have evolved to differ profoundly in aggressiveness, dominance, and sexual strategies. In this view, humans, and especially in their regard, are strictly animal lens. It pays for males to compete with other males for access to young fertile females and try to win and inseminate as many females as possible. The more females a male mates with, the more genes he can pass along. So the human record regarding this principle was achieved by a man who fathered 899 children. However, according to sociobiologists, females need to shop around for the best genetic deal, as it were. Because they can only bear a limited amount of offspring, they have such an investment in each pregnancy, they also must try not to make a mistake. Also, for females, mating with many males versus mating with one male produces no difference in the amount of offspring produced. So females try to attach to the dominant males within the hierarchies available for the resources and status needed to have access to superior genes. This is purely sociobiological, folks. And now I do want to note here, and this is kind of breaking away from that for a second, because when it mentions hierarchies, we're kind of laying the framework here for another cultural debate that's going on right now. But I just want to say that it's important to note that male hierarchies in humans are rooted in competence. It's not a dominance hierarchy, let's say, it's a competence hierarchy. And there are many different hierarchies that are available. You have plumbers, electricians, doctors, dentists, on and on. And so males who are competent and highly skilled will rise to the top of those hierarchies and will have a large networks of people, successful businesses, and accesses to monetary resources. So that I think that's something we need to talk about is that human hierarchies are not rooted in power and dominance. So it's not like a dominance hierarchy like you would think with like primates, lobsters, or any other hierarchies in the world. It's competence hierarchies is what we kind of occupy. Now, if you were to discount the competence hierarchies, one can see how sociobiologists conclude that the two opposite sexual strategies result in the idea that men are more promiscuous, they want to have sex more, they're more drawn to sexual novelty and rape in some cases, whereas women want stability, security, more choosy about their partners, and less concerned with hierarchies in and of themselves. However, evolutionary psychologists agree with the consensus of psychobiologists, except they don't apply it to humans as easily because you cannot make simple generalizations from animal-based studies. If human beings were reproductive fitness maximizers whose main motive is to perpetuate their genes, if this were the case, men would be lined up for miles just to donate their sperm to sperm banks. And that's obviously not the case. Evolutionary psychologists also, unlike sociobiologists, they do not argue from analogies because they are oversimplified and they're misleading, because human beings are so complex you cannot use oversimplified explanations for things. You can't do it. So evolutionary views on mating and sexual behavior is hotly contested because evolutionary theory suggests that men are hardwired for certain behaviors and that women are hardwired for other behaviors. And critics of this view point out that women also can have many male partners. There are also polygamous relationships that tend to be successful. So they accuse evolutionary biologists of playing into stereotypes. Critics also point out that there are social and economic factors that play into how gender roles play themselves out in the world far more than genetic factors. And ultimately what sociobiologists and evolutionary psychologists and their critics are arguing about is how tight and how long is the leash that biology has with culture. Sociobiologists say the leash is tight and short. Evolutionary psychologists say that it's elastic enough to permit culture to modify biological tendencies, and through those tendencies are powerful, but the tendencies are powerful. The social constructionists say that the leash doesn't exist because cultural variations are equal, means that there is no single genetic sexual strategy for human beings whatsoever. So I take the evolutionary psychology view of we have heritable traits. Culture and environmental factors will push on those traits, and then the traits kind of, depending on where you're at within the big five, will kind of show where you're at differentially. That's how I look at it, is from a personality perspective, because that's what I study is personality, and I don't know why the camera went out like that, but okay. So this is a correlational graph here, and so we've been focusing on the origins of human similarities, but now we're going to turn to the second great issue in the nature versus nurture debate, and that's the differences between human beings. There's a critical discussion on what it means to say a trait is heritable. Suppose you want to measure flute playing ability in a large group of music students, but you have some independent raters assign each student a score from 1 to 20. When you plot the scores, you find that some are far less skilled, some fall into a musical genius range, and the majority fall somewhere in the middle. So what causes the variation? Why are some geniuses and some inept? Are the differences genetic, or are they the result of experience and motivation? And so to answer these questions, behavioral geneticists compute a statistic called heritability, which is the proportion of total variance in a trait which is attributed to genetic differences in a population. Many people hold a completely mistaken idea about heritability, so let's just get that out of the way. But as genetic findings pour in, the public will need to understand this concept more than ever. So to fully understand this nature-nurture debate, you have to understand the facts about heritability. Is one, an estimate of heritability applies to a particular group of people living in a particular environment, and estimates may differ for different groups. Heritability estimates do not apply to individuals, only to variations within a group. So it's individuals within a group, not from just individual to individual. Scientists can only explain to the extent of the difference within a population based on their genetic differences. So you can't compare like humans to gorillas or humans to chimps. It doesn't work that way. Only individuals within certain groups. So you can compare like personality traits. You can compare difference of traits within, let's say, a group of Western people versus a group of uncontacted tribesmen. You might find some similarities between the two groups, but you want to also look at individuals. And so that's one thing. And then even highly heritable traits can be modified by the environment. Height is a good example. It's a trait based on genetics. However, a malnourished child may not grow as tall as if they would have if they had sufficient nutrition. So let's get that out. Scientists have no way to estimate the heritability of a trait or behavior directly, so they have to infer it by studying people whose degree of genetic similarity happens to be known. So you might think the best approach is to study blood relatives within a family. However, they also share the same environment, not just the same genes. So what you do is you have to study adopted children as a better approach. Such children share half their genes with each birth parent. They grow up in different environments apart from their birth parents, and they share an environment with their adoptive parents, but not their genes. So researchers can compare correlations between the traits of adopted children and those of their biological or adopted relatives and use the estimates to estimate their heritability. Another approach is to compare identical twins from fraternal twins. Identical twins are the result of a zygote dividing into two separate parts that develop into two different embryos. So they're genetically identical, but they're two different individuals. Whereas fraternal twins are the result of two separate zygotes. So two eggs get fertilized by two different sperm cells, and they become two separate babies. Whereas you have a single sperm cell, a single egg cell, they come together, they start to divide. The cell actually divides completely, and then you have two separate babies come from that. That's the difference from a biological perspective. That's the difference between identical and fraternal twins. So to measure heritability in individual twins, because traits are more heritable between them, they are treated differently and the results are measured. Like if one is more extroverted and the other one's higher in neuroticism or introversion, basically. So human diversity on heritability and intelligence. Behavioral genetic research is not only transforms our understanding of behavior, that was once explained in solely psychological terms, but it also tells us about the intelligence and personality. In heritability studies, the usual measure for intellectual functioning is called an intelligence quotient or an IQ score. The term IQ is a holdover from the early days of psychological testings when IQ tests were given only to children. So what they would do is they would take the mental age, which is the child's level of intellectual development relative to other children, and then they divided that by the child's chronological age and then multiplied that by 100 to yield a quotient. So like for example, if the mental age is 8 and let's say the mental age is 8, you divide it by the chronicle age of say like 16, that gives you what? 8 and 16, that's 2, times it by 100, IQ of, no, I got that wrong. But that's what they would do, is they would take the mental age, divide it by the chronological age, and then it would be multiplied by 100 to yield the quotient. And the scoring method has a serious flaw, and so now the newer IQ tests are scored from a table where the person's score is still compared to others in their age group, but the distribution expected to be considered normal, where the average or mean is in the middle, and high to low scores are considered outliers, and they're out toward the tails in the curve. And I had decided to look at the Wechsler intelligence score, and so basically you have like 2% of people fall within the range of about 2%, 13.5, and so the outliers are 2%, and so it follows this bell curve thing, and it doesn't help me pointing at the screen, so we're going to grab our little red highlighter here. And so this is pretty much what they mean by a normal distribution, is this bell curve. And so 95% of people fall within the 30 points, within 30 points of 100. About 68% of people fall within range of 15 points around 100, so that's like 90, and then less than 2 will fall in the higher ranges of IQ. And so most psychologists believe that IQ tests measure a general quality that affects the aspects of cognitive ability, but the tests have their critics because they argue that intelligence comes in varieties such as musical aptitude, emotional intelligence, and social intelligence, along many other forms of intelligence. And so then we also want to talk about, other critics of IQ argue that the tests are biased because they tap mostly into the abilities of middle-class white people over other ethnicities. But despite important qualifications, the kind of intelligence that produces high IQ scores is highly heritable. In studies of identical twins, for example, the IQ scores are more highly correlated than those of fraternal twins, and the difference that reflects this is the influence of genes. It's not about environment at that point. Now, when it comes to temperament and personality, or genes and personality, let's say you might hear a mother describe her 2 children as like, my daughter's intensely emotional and testy, but my son is the opposite, placid and good natured, and they came out that way, right? Was she right? Is it possible to be born testy or easygoing? Well, psychologists who take a biological perspective to answer that question about personality and temperament do so by studying temperaments in children and heredity studies in twins. Even in the first few weeks of birth, infants differ in activity level, mood, responsiveness, soothability, attention span. Some will be irritable, others will be cranky, some will be calm and sweet nurtured. These differences will be apparent when you control for prenatal influences such as, a mother's nutrition, drug use, or even pregnancy issues. And many psychologists believe the evidence for babies to be born with genetic determined temperaments, which are physiological dispositions to respond to the environment in certain ways. And they may later form the basis of specific personality traits. So Jerome Kagan was a psychologist who studies the different types of temperaments. They're called reactive and non-reactive. He says about 20% of all children are at one extreme or the other, and the rest tend to fall in the middle. Highly reactive infants, even at 4 months, are considered excitable, nervous, they overreact to any little thing, and as they grow, they tend to become more wary, fearful of new things, and even at age 7 might have symptoms of anxiety. So you could say that they probably score high in trait neuroticism. In contrast, non-reactive babies, according to Kagan, are California laid-back babies. I guess that's the terminology they use. They just kind of lie there quietly. They don't really cry. They're outgoing. They're curious, and they continue to be outgoing and extroverted throughout childhood. And children with reactive and non-reactive temperaments have distinctive physiological patterns. Reactive kids tend to show signs of activity in the sympathetic nervous system, which is generally responsible for physiological arousal. And we'll talk about that in the lecture after this one, which is actually going to talk about hormones, neurons, and the brain. We're going to talk about the different, the nervous system will be a part of that. So another way that you could study genetic influences on personalities to estimate the heritability of specific traits. So now we're stepping into my domain. A trait is a habitual way of behaving, thinking, or feeling. You think of that as an orientation in the world, how you act and how you tend to be in the world. So several decades ago, Raymond B. Cattell greatly advanced the study of personality traits by applying what's called a factorial analysis or factor analysis. So what they did is they went through the dictionary and basically factored all the different adjectives that you could use to describe how you would describe a person. And so the factorial analysis analyzes these intercorrelations among different measures of test scores and all these clusters of measures of scores, or scores highly correlated to assume that they measure the same underlying trait. And so today, all of the evidence for a small cluster of fundamental personality traits is so overwhelming that all psychologists agree that the Big Five is the most empirically reliable and valid measure of personality that is stable across the lifespan and has been identified cross-culturally. And so the Big Five are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the reason why I say the traits in that pattern is it spells out what would you call it, an acronym, OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N. So you can say openness, conscientious, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So it helps you kind of keep it straight, right? So that's talking about genes and personality. Extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience is the dimension of personality associated. These are the personality traits within the big five, right? So extroversion is the dimension of personality associated with being outgoing, sociable, positive emotion. If a person is shy or quiet, they're called introverted. So this is an example of Jung's early psychological types. I think I talked about that in the Carl Jung lecture, but I'm not 100% certain. But you can break it down, the trait, into its two lower order aspects, and that's enthusiasm and assertiveness. So assertiveness is about sociability, whereas enthusiasm is your positive emotion. So how cheery and outgoing you're going to be. Neuroticism is your volatility and withdrawal aspects. And so it's the negative emotion dimension that includes aspects such as anxiety, depression, and emotional volatility or liability. Agreeableness is the maternal dimension of personality. Its aspects are politeness and compassion, and this trait describes how good-natured or irritable a person is, whether they're going to be cooperative or competitive. So agreeable people are compassionate and they'll cooperate. Disagreeable people tend to be more competitive. Conscientiousness is the dimension that predicts responsibility. Work ethic and perseverance, that's the industriousness aspect. Or how cleanly and tidy someone is, or how disorderly they might be if they score low in the aspect orderliness. Orderliness is the aspect of the trait that predicts conservative political orientation. So people that are high in conscientiousness and low in orderliness tend to be more conservative. Whereas openness to experience is the creative dimension that predicts whether a person is interested in aesthetics or things, which are like gadgets and stuff. So in this trait, predicts political orientation for more liberal political beliefs. So if you're high in openness and low in conscientiousness, the odds are you're probably more liberal. And what's fascinating about personality is it's not as crystallized as you would expect. It's not just some set thing. Your temperament, sure, but you can extend out the tools you have within the big five to where you can function more optimally in the world. You could be the most disagreeable person in the world, but if you learn how to do something nice for somebody, like once a week or twice a week, you actually find yourself becoming more polite, and so you can work to be a bit more agreeable. So your personality can transform. So it's just important to kind of note that. Now, when you look at it in perspective, the findings on heritability of intelligence and personality are pretty impressive. So impressive that many people forget that if heredity accounts for half the reason people differ in their traits, then the environment, or the errors in measurement, must also account for the other half. So the wave of acceptance of genetic influence on behavior is growing into this tidal wave that threatens to engulf the second message of this research. And that's the same data that provides the reliable evidence for the importance of environmental factors. Other reasons not to jump to the genes are everything conclusion is that not all traits are equally heritable or unaffected by environment. Some studies may underestimate the impact of the environment, and even traits that are highly heritable are not rigidly fixed and they can be modified by experience. So it comes down to this question. How confining is our biology? Well, I guess it depends on what you're measuring and what you mean by confining, or how you want to define that, because many of the qualities are flexible and they can change radically depending on what they are, and the others over time, but within limits. Because, you know, some things might take a long time to try to change, while other experiences might change those traits for you a lot quicker. And so here's the references. Thank you guys for listening to the lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it was a lot of information. And any questions, post them in the comments below. I try to be really good about that. Thank you guys. Remember, hit subscribe if you like the content. Hit the little bell for the notification. And I will see you next time when we talk about neurons, hormones, and the brain within the biological perspective.